All right. Thanks for joining us tonight. I am Derek Morell with Irresistible Truth. We appreciate you coming on. This is going to be a great discussion here on libertarian free will, compatibilism, the nature of our choices. So before we get into it, I want to let you know I'm going to be asking our guest, Colton Carlson, some questions. If you have questions, put them in the comments. And if they are pertaining to what we're talking about, maybe we'll throw them up there. We'll also try to have a dedicated few minutes at the end to do questions. So yeah, before we get into it, Colton Carlson, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Thanks, Derek. So I am a Calvinist, obviously, surprise. And I'm a teacher. So I actually teach mathematics in Arizona in a small town. And I've been teaching for about 5 years. But I also teach philosophy. So I've kind of nabbed that gig about 4 years ago from my principal, and I just love theology. It's always interested me as a kid, even before I was a believer. Asking these, I grew up in the church, but I wasn't a believer in the church until my high school years. So it always interested me in whether or not we have free will, Adam and Eve, whether or not they had free will, and that's the kind of work that I do. I try to do my own philosophy work in freedom of the will, and hopefully in the next couple of years, Lord willing, I'll be able to get a master's in philosophy and go down that route. So we'll see.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. And you alluded to it. So a lot of times, whether you're in these discussion groups or you're talking to friends, and especially if you're talking about theology and soteriology, these questions come up, and it seems that people genuinely don't have a very deep grasp on what they are, and it's easy to get tangled up in various webs, and it's a very practical thing. I think we should all know, and you don't have to live your life learning about philosophy, but I think it's important just to understand the basics and how it works and why we even believe what we believe. So without further ado, let's just do some definitions. Let's define some stuff. So the common term we often hear is libertarian free will. That's going around a lot. I don't believe in libertarian free will, but can you just give us the kind of the standard definition on it, so we all know?
That's the hard, because there's kind of standard definitions of, like, there's so many standard definitions of it, but essentially libertarianism, libertarian free will, or what they call what non-Calvinists usually hold to, soft libertarianism. It's the conjunction of incompatibilism and free will. So as long as you're free, some of the time they would say that you have libertarian freedom, but it's incompatibilism. So determinism cannot obtain as well, which means to me and to most philosophers like Robert Cain, and even hard incompatibilists like Dirk Pervasion, who's the other side, who just believes in determinism, they would agree that libertarianism should just be incompatibilism. So the thesis that responsibility or freedom and determinism cannot be at the same time, they cannot obtain at the same time, that's incompatibilism. But libertarianism is that, and also indeterminism. So that's this tricky part here, because indeterminism can mean a variety of things. What does it mean to be indeterminate, right? So that's where libertarians got to the nitty gritty, and they have posited two conditions, sourcehood and that dual ability, or the categorical ability to do otherwise. That's what indeterminism is to them, right? So
yeah, and that's often, just to jump in, that's often what I hear people say is, you have this choice, and it doesn't have to be about salvation. It could be about anything. And you have this ability to choose otherwise. And I think what they mean by that oftentimes is if you live the same exact time and you would have the same exact scenario, you could have chosen otherwise.
Yes.
Freely, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like this liberty of indifference, like this neutral. They don't really like that language, but I mean, that's what it is. Because you could have done everything outside of you and everything inside of you. You really could have done otherwise. You have categorical access to this opportunity, to that opportunity, and you are the sole agent to cause those modal pathways to come into existence.
Got it.
So, yeah, it's like I said, it's a tricky definition, but usually it just boils down to those two things: sourcehood, efficient sourcehood, like original, like I'm the original cause.
You are the source. Yeah.
Yeah, and then alternative possibilities, categorical alternative possibilities.
Okay, and we're going to unpack this a little bit more, but just to lay the groundwork, you have what you are. I think you are, and I am compatibilists. A lot of most Calvinists are compatibilists or or soft determinists. Could you just give us kind of where does that fit in with all this stuff?
So compatibilism, if properly understood, is the thesis that, traditionally understood, is the thesis that freedom and determinism are compatible. So the sticky thing is, what does freedom mean? And so a lot of incompatibilists have been pushing back on that. So within the last 50 years or so, contemporary philosophy has been kind of gearing up towards the thesis that compatibilism is the thesis that moral responsibility and determinism are compatible. So they kind of skip past that free will part and just kind of put in the moral responsibility. And as a Calvinist, and as a Calvinist for you, I like that. To be honest, I really don't care whether or not we're free. I care whether or not we're responsible to God.
Right.
Because that to me, according to the gospel, is the most important thing. So are you responsible to believe and to love him, or are you not?
And is that kind of where you might hear the term, okay, we don't believe in libertarian free will, but we believe we're free moral agents?
Yes. So I don't believe in libertarian freedom because the necessary condition for libertarian freedom is that sourcehood in alternative possibilities. Mm-hmm. So I don't believe if we follow the Westminster 3:1, we are not the efficient or originator source of our actions. God is, because of his decree. Right. So we don't have that. And then we can't have categorical access because whatever he has decreed, we could not categorically do otherwise. So we already deny those two conditions. So we can't hold libertarian freedom. I think consistent Calvinists cannot hold libertarian freedom. There's debate about that. But
I agree with you. I actually had a debate with a libertarian Calvinist like a few months back. All right. So we talked a little bit about libertarian free will. Again, we're going to jump into this stuff, unpack a little more. We talked a little bit about compatibilism and the definition, how the free will is, or freedom's compatible with determinism. Now talk about determinism. So talk about, you often hear, compatibilism, that's just, it's polishing something up. It's really determinism. They're just saying this so it sounds better. Talk to us a little bit about determinism specifically.
Yeah. So first, compatibilism is the thesis that moral responsibility and determinism are compatible. It says nothing of whether or not determinism obtains or whether or not determinism is true. And it also says nothing about whether or not moral responsibility is true. It's just the thesis that the two could be true together. So when people say, like, Tim Stratton is a big proponent, Leighton Flowers is another big proponent, compatibilism, AKA determinism, that's completely false. There's no entailment. Like, one has to do with the theory and one has to do with the thesis. So there's just two different things. A theory of freedom is not compatibilism. And that's one of the main jabs proponents have at us, because we usually posit a sufficiency for freedom. Like libertarianism posits alternative possibilities. If you have it, you're free. But we don't necessarily have that. So it's more, compatibilism is more of a thesis rather than an actual theory of the will. And so I want to make that clear as day. With that said, I take it that compatibilism doesn't entail determinism.
Right.
However, determinism can often be synonymous with compatibilism, and that's where you hear the soft determinism. That's what you said, right?
Yep.
So you said soft determinism, and that was from William James like 100 years ago, and I don't necessarily mind that. I think Calvinists, if they're consistent, they should be a soft determinist, but they are a soft determinist not because they're compatibilists. I would say they're compatibilists because they're determinists. So I think you have to kind of like bounce and balance those two together. So I I make the distinction that there's two types of Calvinists. There's a Calvinist that's like, for me, I call them soft Calvinists. They're like the tulip Calvinists. Like they're my tulip. Like I love my tulip, and that's all they know about Calvinism is just tulip.
Right.
Okay, so I would classify them as a soft Calvinist because then libertarian freedom may be compatible with that. But if you're a hard Calvinist, like a Reformed Orthodox Calvinist, you believe in the early Reformers, you read the Reformers, you believe in the Confessions, the London Baptists, the three forms of unity, the Westminster, and you're following in that tradition, then there's no way that I think you can affirm something like libertarianism, because the Westminster, I think, affirms determinism. So determinism, the definition, I would just say everything is necessitated by sufficient events, sufficient causes, or sufficient conditions. And that is similar to what James N. Anderson, another Calvinist compatibilist, would probably give for determinism, that everything is necessitated, all events are necessitated by sufficient conditions. And if we believe in God, those sufficient conditions arrive from God's decree.
Got it. All right. So you said God. So let's tie this in. And I'm going to ask you a little bit later about specifically like compatibilism, because it's not synonymous with Christianity. It's there's atheists that are compatibilists, and there's atheists that believe in libertarianism and all this stuff. So before we even get into that, how does all of this work with salvation? So do the spiritual part with say choosing Christ, and then say, how does it work with, like, you're going to choose chocolate ice cream, something so basic, and you don't have to tie. I mean, just give us a 30,000 foot view from our position, from your position, how this moral responsibility and determinism, how it's all working in both the small things that we do every day, and then obviously with the big one being salvation.
Yeah, I think that if you're a consistent Calvinist, a hard Calvinist, following after the tradition, the Westminster and so forth, then every single decision you make is determined by God's decree. So what I eat for ice cream, my drink of water that I had a second ago, that was determined. Now the fact is how you are determined is really the key here. I think a lot of incompatibilists or indeterminists, non-Calvinists would say, oh, you're determined. So you're determined to say that you're determined. It's self-refuting. Well, that needs to be shown, but not just asserted to me personally. But it relates to God's, to theism and to soteriology, because God is the sufficient originator cause of your salvation. That's why we would claim monergism, because he is the original cause of your salvation. You are not the original cause of your salvation. God is. And so that's a signature part, and the MO of Calvinism is monergism, right? The irresistible grace. And so that's part of it. I think if you follow the TULIP acronym all the way down, I really don't see how you could get anything other than determinism. When you're totally unable to respond to the gospel, and you're unconditionally elected, and God sent his son to only die for the elect, I mean, the I and the P pretty much follow. And that just is in the best possible consistent framework that you can interpret that would be through the deterministic lens.
Got it. So let's say on the Christian aspect for a second. Are there
Sure.
any key verses that you appreciate or that you kind of like, that kind of gives a picture of, how it works, or a picture of it happening in the scripture or anything like that? Or is there anything you go to if you're trying to describe it in the Bible?
Yeah, there's a couple, but I have to be straightforward that I'm primarily Calvinist for philosophical reasons. So I do use, obviously, the Bible. I'm a Christian, so obviously I use the Bible, but there's
Right.
not a lot of verses, because I think you can kind of swiggle out of them, out of the Calvinistic interpretation or the compatibilist interpretation. But one verse that I personally like is James chapter 1. So James
Mhm.
chapter 1, I think it's verse 17, verse 14, somewhere around there, 12 through 14. Basically, it signifies that evil comes out of the desires of our heart. And so that's where evil lies. And Christ alluded to that too, I think in Matthew 7, I believe. I can't remember, but obviously Christ is always talking about sins coming out of the heart, not out of the mouth, but out of the heart, right?
Yeah,
And so,
Matthew 12, like 2022. I actually had a note there. Yeah, the treasure of the heart, and all that stuff. Yeah.
yes. Yeah. So I think those are really, really big proponents that we're in some way, shape, or form constrained to our nature.
Mm.
Okay, we could not do other than our nature. And I understand that libertarianism is not the thesis or not the definition that you could do other than your nature. Okay, I understand that. And we can talk about that later because I somewhat disagree with those kinds of definitions of libertarianism for good reasons, I think.
Mhm.
But at the end of the day, I would use those kinds of verses, I think, to show compatibilism. Genesis 50:20, God intended for evil, or God intended for good what Joseph's brothers intended for evil.
Yep.
I think Isaiah 10, the chapter where Assyria, God basically determined Assyria to overcome Israel there, and he still condemned them for it. And it's right there in the passage. He straight up condemned them. I was like, oh, that's neat. Compatibilism, or something like it, right? So passages like that, I think, give a strong credence.
Yeah, and I love that Isaiah 10 one because you're right. The Assyrians, so God punished Israel, but he pretty much determined the Assyrians to do it, made them do it essentially, right? Caused them to do it. And then he punished the Assyrians for attacking Israel. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite the, yeah.
That one.
Yeah. So I want to talk about something that oftentimes comes up because people just don't understand Calvinism. People just get it all mixed up. So one of the big things kind of on that determinism train, you'll hear, oh, you guys are fatalists, or, your God, he's a puppet master. He's pulling these strings and we're just sitting there like, da, 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 like we're programmed like a robot. Yeah. What do you say to those people? And is there kind of a fundamental fallacy that you see in that, or is it just ignorance, or what would you come back with something like that?
It is a fallacy. I would say it's an undistributed middle fallacy. So I'll explain the fatalism first, and then I'll go to the puppet master. So fatalism, usually the argument goes like this: Calvinism entails determinism. Fatalism entails determinism. Therefore, Calvinism entails fatalism. What doesn't follow is the conclusion. It's a formal fallacy. It's an undistributed middle. It does not follow that just because Calvinism and fatalism have determinism in their consistent form, related to each other, that they have that in common, does not mean every part of Calvinism is fatalism. In fact, if you're a Calvinist, I would say it actually disproves fatalism, because fatalism doesn't even care about moral responsibility. All they care about is the ends. That this will happen, X will happen, no matter what you do. But Calvinism doesn't say that. Calvinism says X will happen through what you do. So we are still morally responsible through that avenue. The means are still intact. The secondary cause is still intact in Calvinism. There's no secondary cause in fatalism. It's completely just out of the window. They don't care about it. That's what fatalism is. So to say that compatibilism and determinism is just equal or entails fatalism is absolutely bonkers. There's so many philosophers that I can name off the top of my head, some of whom are incompatibilists, like Kevin Tempe and even Van Inwagen. Both, a chief incompatibilist, both say there's no way determinism could ever equal fatalism or ever entail fatalism. Because then you could say, oh, Calvinism entails determinism, determinism entails fatalism, so therefore Calvinism entails fatalism. Well, okay, so that syllogism is valid, but is it sound? No, because even your own philosophers disagree with it. Even your own philosophers say that determinism, there's no way that it can entail fatalism. It's its own ballpark. Right. And so It's really, honestly, when I encounter that in like our discussion forums, it's just a non-starter. I just roll my eyes because
You know where this conversation's going, right?
yeah, it's just a fallacy. It's an undistributed middle. And unfortunately, big name, libertarians like Flowers himself does it all the time, which is really unfortunate. But the robot one is the same thing. So it's an undistributed middle fallacy, just because the robot and humans underneath Calvinism have something something in common, namely determinism, does not mean that they have all things in common. But that's what they need to prove. They're trying to press the argument by analogy, saying essentially a strong claim that there's no relevant difference between humans underneath a puppet master or a robot underneath its programmer than humans under determinism. There's no relevant difference. But all we have to do is point out the relevant difference, and then it's just false. And the relevant difference, I would say, is self-consciousness or conscience, really, just moral agency, to be honest.
Yeah.
So the Imago Dei, I mean, I can point out, those are just three relevant differences I've pointed out. False. It doesn't follow. And yet the burden is on them to show that kind of claim, and it's just not been shown.
Right. So you said the M word, the morality, right? So obviously one of your definitions that early on in compatibilism is that determinism is compatible, not even necessarily freedom, but it's the morality side of it. So you often hear, and I'm trying to talk practically, a lot of us are in these groups and we're debating this stuff, but you often hear, okay, you're a compatibilist, so therefore, regardless, there's still determinism there. So if there's determinism, you can't, at the end of the day, you can't choose one way or the other. So how are you morally responsible? So that's a loaded question. I know there's, books written on this, many books, but what would you kind of, say to something like that? Where do you get the argument that you can still have morality?
Well, first, when they press that argument that if it's compatibilism, there's determinism somewhere, again, that's not the definition of compatibilism. I think hard Calvinists like myself and you probably do affirm determinism, and that's fine. But just to jump there, you'd kind of need an argument for that. Compatibilism in its core thesis does not entail determinism. It's just not there. Right. All it says is that if determinism obtained, and if moral responsibility obtained, then they could be true together. That's the thesis of compatibilism. It says nothing that determinism is there, actually present. Now, for Calvinists, because we do, if we believe in the Westminster and so forth, yes, we probably should affirm determinism of some kind. So how do we get morality? There's a couple of theories, so I'll kind of just be brief in sketching them, but there's a couple of theories of compatibilism here. So there's classical compatibilists, which goes all the way back to Locke and Hobbes, basically positing a conditional analysis that, yes, it's true that I don't have the categorical ability to do otherwise, but I do have the conditional ability to do otherwise. That has died out in the last 50 years, but it's actually in the last 10 years or so, it's kind of coming back with like a new form. It's called dispositional analyses. So Bierofsky, I think is how you pronounce it, Bierofsky. If you look at the Oxford Handbook of Free Will, he has some work on the conditional analysis or dispositional analyses. So it's not as necessarily dead, but a lot of philosophers just look at it as kind of junk. So that's one that you could derive moral responsibility from there, or at least say that we are responsible if the conditional analysis or the dispositional analysis is present, something along those lines. There's other theories that I think are a little bit perhaps more robust, such as semi-compatibilism. That's probably the gold standard of compatibilism right now in contemporary philosophy. That's that book that I recommended. He goes through that. Semi-compatibilism. It's basically known as guidance control, and it's promoted by philosophers such as Fisher and Ravizza. So they've made an awesome book in 1998 called Responsibility and Control. So those are, I would say those are probably the two best theories. But
So we have our our friend Finney here, who doesn't agree with us, which is fine.
I
He
love
has
Finney.
he has a few questions. Let me see if I could pop a couple of them up. So he's asking, and since it's dealing with what we're talking about, we'll jump in here. Does compatibilism entail that humans have the ability to be morally perfect in the sense that any act they could have done the right thing had they wanted to? This is like the otherwise argument, right? Could have done otherwise.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand the question here. So does compatibilism entail that humans have the ability to be morally perfect? Doesn't entail that they have the ability to be categorically perfect. I would say that's incompatibilism, or at least libertarianism, if you want to be more specific. That does entail that you could possibly be morally perfect, and that's what we call the Pelagian argument against libertarianism, in the sense that for any act they could have done the right thing had they wanted to. They could have done the right thing had they wanted to, but they didn't. So I think I'm understanding that question.
Yeah, it's more of like kind of an abstract thing. And then he has a follow-up here. I don't know if this is related. Would you say that the Bible never speaks of ability or inability in categorical terms?
Yeah, I think that most of the verses, such as like Genesis 4 with Cain, they usually use towards that. 1 Corinthians 10:31, a lot of libertarians use those kinds of verses. I just don't think the Bible speaks in terms of philosophical ability. I think you could probably swing it both ways. So I think you can swing the categorical ability there, and you could probably swing the conditional ability. I just don't think we could presuppose what type of philosophical ability is chosen there. I think to get to the conclusion of what kind of ability should be there, we would need to go through the systematic route, the systematic theology there, and what fits best in the systematic. Because I don't think hermeneutical, grammatical structure does anything. That's why I'm a philosopher.
Yeah. And how about, it kind of runs into this a little bit, but the old adage, I think it was Kant that came up with it, does ought or ought implies can, or I'm asking you, does ought imply can? So you ought to do this, meaning if I tell you that, then the assumption is that you can actually do it.
Yeah. So again, he was probably thinking, Kant originally was probably thinking in terms of categorical, and that's fine. He had the categorical imperative. So in order for his moral philosophy to work, he kind of needed that. So good for him, bully for him. But you can also interpret it conditionally. I don't see why you couldn't interpret it conditionally. If, in fact, even if you interpreted it categorically, kind of runs into some question or some problems. I've met many libertarians who actually deny the ought implies can, because they give a host of counterexamples. The guy is has to owe money to the because he's gambled so much, so he has to owe money, but he can't afford it. So, I mean, he ought to give the money back, but he categorically does not have the money to give it back. But does that negate his moral obligation to give the money back? No. So just because he can't do it doesn't mean that there's not a moral obligation there. In fact, even with Christians, I think all Christians should deny that the ought implies can, primarily because it says it right there in Romans 2 and 3. The law was given to us, not that we would obey, but that we would understand why and how Christ died for us, namely because we're sinners. So the law was there to show us our sin, not so that we could obey it. But if we can't obey the law, then if we take that maxim at its full strength, then we're not morally obligated to follow the law. And clearly, that doesn't follow. Romans 7 says, Paul says emphatically, even though I have struggles with following the law, it is still a good thing. Why? Because it shows us our sin. Nothing of the sort of this categorical ought or implies can is positive there. So I just think it's a faulty maxim.
Yeah, and I think that from my experience, it seems like this point is one of those hinge points. Talking to other believers who might not be in the same camp with us with Calvinism. So you have, a libertarian or a provisionist or Arminian or something like that, and they'll refer to any imperative statement in the Bible. You ought to do this, you ought to believe, you ought, just, and there's a lot of them, right?
Any choice in the Bible,
And they imply
say it's
all of this baggage
libertarian.
to all of that.
Yeah, and I think that's false. It doesn't say that. It just says choice. And then they say, well, you can't make a choice. You don't have a choice underneath determinism. Well, try this out for sorts. God determined me to have a choice. I have a choice. So if God determined me to choose X, I will choose X. God determined me to choose X, I will choose X. You know what doesn't follow? That I don't have a choice. That doesn't follow. I do have a choice, and God determined my choice. So if they say that, they're presupposing the categorical garden of forking paths presupposition there. That they're just putting their own libertarian spin on that verse. Now, granted, that's fine, but I just don't think it fits within the whole scheme of the systematic, namely, like what I just said to you before, the gospel. It just doesn't follow. The category doesn't follow. Yeah.
And that's really good, because I mean, that's probably one of the most common things I see, is that basic level, you're denying scripture because, do this, do that. And again, it's all that baggage. And also it's the implication that they believe that you could have chosen otherwise. So if you plug that into the whole situation, it kind of gets their presuppositions on that. But even when we talked several months back, when you recommended that book, it even talked about, I think he quoted Feinberg, and there was like 8 types of can.
Yeah.
And only one of them doesn't fit with compatibilism, and it was the choose otherwise. But there's 7 other senses of can that's totally fine.
Yeah, that was in his No One Like Him book in the early 2000s. This masterpiece, really huge book. It's like 800 some pages, almost 1,000. But yeah, Feinberg does have an awesome section in there where he identifies 8, right? 8 different senses or something like that.
There's 8, and 7 of them are fine, and then there's the one that goes into the choosing otherwise is not.
That's the one that libertarians want to hold on to, which again, that's fine. Be my guest, hold on to it, but then we need an argument for it. So.
Right. All right, so now I'm going to give you the zinger, man. You ready?
Sure.
So when we get into this whole, again, determinism and the shuffle here, and you're talking to someone that doesn't even truly understand it, I think what you alluded to before is you have to make sure the framework's right. Like, don't let people cheat on their definitions. Don't make people set up these arguments that are just straw men. But that aside, did God author sin? So that's a big one. And tell me about the sense of author. Of course, the Westminster Confession, the London Baptist says in chapter 3, that he did not author sin, but he did ordain everything that comes to pass. So what is your take on that? And how is this all mixed and work in your opinion?
Yeah, so Jonathan Edwards has an awesome passage in his Freedom of the Will book, basically going through this exact same question. And he says it like something like this. I'll try to paraphrase. There is a sense in which God authors sin, but in that sense, it's just that he causes the circumstances in which sin obtains. So he's just the creator of the world, essentially. I know I'm kind of paraphrasing briefly, but that's what it is. Like, in that sense, he is the author of it. He allowed it to come about for his good purposes. Okay, he has determined it to come about for his good purposes. Now, he's not culpable in that sense, but there is a sense in which he is culpable, namely that he's the efficient cause of that sin. And that is the cause, that is the sense in which libertarians and non-Calvinists like to press us with, that if God determines sin, he is the efficient cause of the sin. And no, it does not follow that he is the efficient cause of the sin if he determined the sin.
He's not pulling the trigger. He's not doing the actual sin, right? Yeah.
In fact, I think a lot of the reformers, and this has kind of been lost in our circles, but pervasion theory works freaking wonders here. I really, really like pervasion theory. And essentially it says that evil is not really a thing. It's not like a positive substance. So when I say it's not a thing, I don't mean like it's not something that affects us, but It's something that's just not positive.
Right.
The good or the righteous is like from God. That's the actual positive substance. So just like the darkness is just absent when light is there, same thing when sin is absent when God is there. So in that sense, God cannot be or the efficient cause of something that's not even a positive substance. So when they say, oh, God's the author of sin, he determines it, he's the efficient cause, blah, blah, blah. Well, God can't be the efficient cause of sin because he can't be the efficient cause of something that's negative. He can only be the efficient cause of something that's positive, and that is good. So that rescues, in my opinion, that rescues God's supposed moral culpability there. And so, yes, there's two senses in which God is the author of sin. He's the author of sin in which he authors it and determines it to come about, but he's not the author of sin in which he efficiently does that action. We are still responsible because we, in the actual sequence of events, in the temporal chronological sequence of events, we are the ones as secondary causes to do that action. So I think if anyone's watching, an awesome book to read is not only Freedom of the Will from Edwards, but Calvinism and the Problem of Evil from Johnson and Alexander, who edited it. And it has tons of essays from compatibilist Calvinists and non-Calvinists alike in that, going over the author of sin charge and how can God cause sin but yet not be morally culpable for it. It's a really phenomenal book.
Good. Yeah. And I've heard it put this way, and it really resonated with me, but talking about sin and God and his involvement. And I heard it this way. Let's see if I get it right. God decrees what he wills, but he doesn't directly will sin, and that he's the efficient cause. However, he ordains all of the circumstances that include sin and evil for, and it's kind of like what you said, for there's a better reason, a better good, a better something out there that we don't even comprehend. Now, would you say there's a difference between a decree and ordination, something like that? Would you consider those kind of on the same level, or is there more nuance there?
I mean, should we equate them? Should they equal each other or something like that?
Yeah, if we say, because sometimes I'll use ordain as like he ordains the circumstances, and I'll use decrees for like it's the big kind of the big D, and then the ordination is more like the providence, the day in day out stuff.
Yeah, I do kind of blur them together. I'm not going to lie, namely because I think the Westminster blurs them together.
Yeah.
So when they say God ordains all that comes to pass, I mean, the Molinist agrees to that. So
Yeah,
they should, given their worldview. But I do kind of blur them all together. But I do make a distinction because I think it's a necessary distinction. God decrees all things, but he doesn't decree sin because it's not technically a positive thing. So when they say, oh, God decrees all things, sin is a thing, part of that thing, so God decrees sin. Well, not technically. He negatively, I say, he negatively decrees or determines sin. Mm-hmm. So that makes him the deficient cause of sin, but not the efficient cause of sin. All the while, he is still in control. Why? Because he's the sufficient cause of sin. So he can be the sufficient cause of sin without being morally culpable. I think that he's not the efficient cause of sin, but rather the deficient and sufficient cause of it. So you can still maintain a deterministic, meticulous, sovereign control, yet rescue God from the author of sin because he's not the efficient cause. And he is rather the negative cause or the negative determiner of that sin. So if you're wondering how that can go about, there is what we call Frankfurt style examples. And so you've probably obviously heard of them. But I guess for the listener, a Frankfurt style example goes something like this. And I use this on my wife all the time, who's probably watching. But let's just say she goes into a fridge and I ask her to get Coke Zero. Okay. And she tries to give me a nasty LaCroix. So I want a Coke Zero. She wants to give me a LaCroix. And let's just say, unbeknownst to her, I put something in her brain, not removing her agency, just put something in her brain so I can monitor from my bedroom whether or not she will give me a Coke or LaCroix. If she decides to give me a LaCroix, I will switch her brain to give me a Coke instead. Okay. That's what we call the alternative sequence. And that is bypassing the agent. And I do think in that alternative sequence, she's not morally responsible for giving me the Coke. But that's not the sequence we care about. The sequence we care about is what we call the actual sequence. When she chooses to give me a Coke in the actual sequence of events. In other words, I'm monitoring her the whole time she chooses to give me the Coke of her own deliberations. And I don't need to do anything from my bed. She comes in the bedroom, she gives me a Coke, I'm happy, she's happy. She chose out of her own free will. So Frankfurt, Harry Frankfurt in 1969 developed these kind of styles. And he basically said, does my wife have the ability to do otherwise? She couldn't, in either scenario, either the actual sequence or the alternative sequence, she couldn't have given me a LaCroix. So she could only have given me a Coke Zero. So she gives me a Coke Zero, but yet we would intuitively say she's morally responsible, even though she doesn't have the ability to do otherwise. I say all that to say this: how can God negatively determine things? Because there's that passive active pair there, where I am active in one sequence and passive in another. If I'm active in one sequence, I could possibly damage her agency, yes, but that's not the sequence that necessarily obtains when us, the agents, sin. What obtains is not the alternative sequence where I damage her agency by bypassing her to give me the Coke, by forcing her to give me the Coke, which is what libertarians think God does. It's not that. What we care about is the actual sequence, that in the actual sequence, the agent does what she wants to out of her own deliberations. My wife gives me the Coke out of her own deliberations. I'm passive as the counterfactual intervener or God, and I don't do anything. And we see this in scripture, actually, Romans 1, where God just leaves them, right? God just leaves them to their own devices. That, I would say, is a passive Frankfurt style example, where God could be meticulously in control. If he gave them grace, they would do this, okay, with certainty. And if he withheld grace, which he does in Romans 1, they would just go through their natural devices. And so I think obtaining this negative positive decree saves the author of sin charge against God. And I think Calvinists ought to use it a lot more than they do.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff there. So people are gonna have to go and rewind that one. And so there was a comment here. It wasn't a question, but I like hitting the elephant in the room comments. Like, I don't think there's any reason to be afraid of them. I think all the hard stuff should be talked about. So let me put this on the screen here.
Yeah.
Non-Calvinists would still accuse Calvinists of God being a moral monster. You probably heard that before, which, in my opinion, you could say that about any Christian, if anyone that believes in God, but nonetheless, what is your take on that, on moral culpability for God, on, is it just God could do what he wants with his creation, with his creatures, and just call it a day? Or is there more that you like to unpack with that? I mean, that is a deeper question, and there's a lot of nuance there.
Well, he can, because the Bible says he can. So he can do whatever he wants with his creation. That's what the Bible says. Psalm 115:3, he does whatever he pleases. He's in the heavens and he does whatever he pleases. We see that he clearly took out whole tribes in the Old Testament, just not willy-nilly. Obviously, he deliberated about it, and he had good reasons for it. But that's the point. He has good reasons for what he does. And so when we talk about God being a moral monster, I mean, the atheists see all Christians as being just ridiculously insane for believing a God who takes out whole tribes. So my wife also calls this, I love her so much for this, it's amazing. She called it an ecclesiodicy, because it's like a theodicy, but we're trying to give it to another theist. That question right there is not a Calvinist question. that question we should all gang up against the atheist towards.
Exactly.
Stop with these ecclesiodicies and let's start developing strong theodicies towards the atheist. Because again, underneath our own view, is God a moral monster for just killing out whole tribes? And I mean, they deserved it, right? They did what they wanted, but that's what the Calvinists have been saying all along. So I really don't see the point of that comment there.
Yeah, and let me give you a part B. So one of the, someone that's a non-Calvinist that's really pushing the issue, or even an atheist, they'll be like, yeah, you're saying that. I get it. They deserved it, but didn't God determine them to do whatever it was that they deserved? So, Jeremiah, was it 9? People sacrifice their babies, and then a few verses later, God causes them to eat their babies and stuff like that. So,
yeah,
would you fall that all under the sovereign will of God doing as He wants to creatures? I mean, would you even tie any morality into that? Because to me, if it's anytime we tie morality and placing God under the morality umbrella, so to speak, I mean, it doesn't, I don't even know if that's even a logical thing to do, or if it's more of a category error and all that. So,
yeah, that's a good question. I would still probably fall back on the negative decree there. And maybe a category error, because I think Calvinists are notorious, for good measure, for good reasons, for trying to not bridge the gap between creature and creator. I think we have to make those distinctions. It is perfectly in God's prerogative to kill out whole tribes. It just is. He does it for good reasons, whether or not we know those reasons. That's the point. And
right.
So it is perfectly in his prerogative to make a creation and then kill it, just because he's God, because he's the creator. And whether or not we know what those reasons are, I don't think it follows that there are no reasons. But that's what the non-Calvinist usually wants to say. There are no reasons why God would do this. Why would he do this? He must be a moral monster. Well, again, underneath your own worldview, underneath all Christian worldviews, he does these supposedly horrendous acts. But what we should do is say that he does them for good reasons, and that there is a creature category bridge there between the creature and the creator, like you said. And that's what we have to hold on to. And so his morality is, because he's just intrinsically impeccable, his idea, realm, reality, or form of morality is just vastly different than ours. And that's, I think, the beauty of Calvinism. Because once you see that beauty, that you are not that moral and he is, you just fall to your knees irresistibly. And so that's why, that's one of the reasons why I'm a Calvinist. But it also fits into this, discussion here.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you mentioned Jonathan Edwards, the Freedom of the Will, awesome book. It's one of those books, like, you have to, like, for me anyway, you read a page, you're like, wait, what did I just read? And I have to read it again. And he has like these long run-on sentences and stuff. Brilliant guy. But so talk about the will. And so when people even say a free will, or our will's free or it's not free, or our will's bound by our nature, or any of this stuff. So why do we choose, and where does that come from? Is that coming from our mind? Is it coming from our something else, inclinations? Can you give a kind of, tell us what really happening when people talk about the will and, you willed that to happen? What are they really saying?
So that's, like I said, one of the problems I think with compatibilism throughout the ages, throughout the centuries, is they are very lenient and very careful and cautious to posit any sort of sufficiency for their freedom, for their will, because any amount of sufficiency that they could attempt to put in, it could easily be something like fall to like manipulation cases. But with that said, I think something along the lines of our greatest desires, but I don't think that's exactly it. I think when we say, oh, you're free to do what you want to do, and that's it, I think that falls to manipulation cases. It's just basically open range to the incompatibilist. So I think that's part of it, but I don't think it's all of it. So I think there are other parts such as reasons responsiveness. So we respond to reasons moderately, and Fisher and Raviza in their 98 book explain more in detail what that is. I think that's another part. Mechanism ownership could probably be another sufficient part of moral responsibility. That's where we get the idea of sourcehood incompatibilism. So it's not just source incompatibilism, but we can have source compatibilism, but it's just a different type of source. And so those can work as sufficiencies. Those are the ones that I personally lean to the most. There's others like, I think Frankfurt's hierarchical model, like second order desires, you want to do what you want to do. But again, I think that falls to sufficient manipulation cases there. So I try to, and I think modern Calvinists do too, they try to be very cautious on how they tiptoe, like how does our will work in responsibility? I think it's sort of sufficient, and I think also necessary that we as agents underneath Calvinism or non-Calvinism, that we respond to reasons, and that's why we are morally responsible, and that we take ownership of that mechanism in the actual sequence. And I think those are probably the two most conditions of what's necessary for responsibility and possibly sufficient. I think that answers your question.
No, it does. And as you were talking, if I recall, and I haven't opened up the Edwards book in quite a while, but I remember he had a pretty simple kind of quip or definition. He said basically the will is the mind choosing. And it seems so simple, being that it was Edwards who writes a lot about things. Is that just as oversimplification to kind of water it down to the basic level, or
that Edwards said that the mind is choosing?
That the will is the mind choosing.
I don't think that's necessarily bad to say something like that. I see Finney's comment about Edwards and being a fatalist, and he was a necessitarian, so he definitely did believe in complete necessity, like hardcore. Whether or not he went out of bounds to the Reformed tradition is up for scholarly debates. I think there's both good arguments on both sides, but I think he did try to posit some sort of rational spontaneity, which is what the Reformers basically called reasons responsiveness. So he did try to sort of slip in that it's not just our heart, our will that guides us to do what we do, but it's also our mind. Like we have to be able to think about what we're doing and how we're doing it. So yes, I think that's a good simplification. I don't know if I would necessarily use it, but I think it's an okay simplification.
Yeah. And so I'm going to bring another comment you often see from the non-Calvinist camp that is, into the soteriology and anti-Calvinism, this and that, is they'll say, well, foreknowledge is not causative, right? And we might be like, well, okay, but, and they'll be like modal fallacy. But there's the necessity of the consequence and necessity of the consequent, which does not play in, it's not the modal fallacy if you're coming at it from our position.
Yeah. So kind of going back to fatalism, I think that's another distinction between Calvinism and fatalism, because Calvinism says it's necessity of the consequence, which keeps the original contingency of P and Q, or whatever those events are, intact. Whereas the necessity of the consequent is like straight up fatalism. Like it doesn't matter what the means are, the consequent there, if P implies Q, Q is absolutely necessary. And so Calvinism posits what we call a hypothetical necessity. And actually, the one who probably popularizes modal fallacy from Calvinists is William Lane Craig in his Only Wise God book.
It's a contemporary modern construct. It's getting thrown around.
And so he tries to say like, it's that he says that theological fatalists, which he takes to be determinists, which I think is an equation, but an equivocal fallacy, but whatever. He takes that theological fatalism, basically argue necessarily if God foreknows that P will do X, P will do X. God foreknows that P will do X, therefore necessarily P will do X. And he's right. It is a modal fallacy because it doesn't transfer. Well, all you have to do is just put the necessity back in premise 2 and keep the necessity as a necessity of a consequence and not a consequent.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're fine. I believe in that book, Preciado, A Reformed View of Freedom. He talks a lot about this. He doesn't use the word necessity there. He uses the word immutably. So immutably, if God foreknows P will do X, then P will do X. Immutably, God foreknows that P will do X, therefore immutably P will do X. And that kind of, I think, evades some minor concerns for saying that, God's foreknowledge was necessary, but now we're just saying God's foreknowledge is immutably. It cannot be changed. And we can say it cannot be changed based off his decree. So there's a couple of skip-scops that we have to kind of, go around and everything, but I think it can be done.
Well, and I see, and we're not getting into too much theology here, but just as something I notice is it seems like a lot of people are jumping into the open theism camp, and it's almost because of these topics, because the person who believes in God's exhaustive omniscience, he knows the future, man, 100 years from now, whatever. They're in a rock and a hard place, because if God truly knows it and it's foreknowledge, and they're saying, but involved with the actions, there's no determinism there, then what makes those events, those actions certain in God's knowledge? Because we didn't exist before. And I always say, like, was it, am I Derek 2.0 and Derek 1.0 already lived? And I'm just, I'd be rehashing all of his actions. And so I think that's a void that, and usually when I bring it up, it's the first thing is, well, it's not causative, foreknowledge isn't causative. And that's the write-off, and, next topic. And I try not to let people off the hook on that, because I think it's an important piece. And a lot of people jump into the open theism camp and kind of avoids that, but it brings on another 20 problems. So what is your kind of view on that?
I think that's true. I don't think foreknowledge is causative, but I also don't think, I just don't posit that's cause. We're constrained by foreknowledge, but that doesn't mean by God's foreknowledge, but that doesn't mean it needs to be causative. Now, Craig says, what does it mean to be constrained by, foreknowledge? And then he just calls it unintelligible. Well, that's question begging. Why is it unintelligible? You need to give a reason for why it's unintelligible. But regardless, yes, the open theists and the Calvinists alike are saying that freedom and foreknowledge are incompatible. So in that, we have it in common, right? Freedom, libertarian freedom, and categorical freedom and foreknowledge are incompatible. So yes, we have that in common. But what we differ on is how God chooses to providentially, to go about that. Now, if we kind of leave open theism off to the side and we're talking like, I don't know, like a two-moleness or something, or a simple foreknowledge, and those are usually the ones that say, foreknowledge isn't causative. Those are usually the ones that say that, right? I would just kind of go one step back and just kind of get to the root of the question. How can God know what a free creature would do? How? Molinists like to posit, well, he just knows, or middle knowledge. How does he have middle knowledge? Super comprehension. What is that? And why do we know that God has it? It seems that they're still question begging. I haven't found any good argument for super comprehension. And there are good ones. You can just pick up any Molinist book and pretty much find it out. But I think it's question begging. Same thing for simple foreknowledge. I just think they backfire into determinism. Simple foreknowledge, in order to figure out how free creatures could be libertarianly free, yet God have foreknowledge, they usually posit something like Frankfurt style examples, like what I explained before. David Hunt is a big Frankfurt style example person, and it's what we call blockage cases, that they couldn't have done otherwise. But then if they couldn't have done otherwise, and what God simply foreknows, then are they even free? So it's kind of sticky when it comes to those things. I think at least the open theist is consistent enough to say that yes, not compatible, we're free. God just doesn't foreknow
Mm.
the future.
Yeah, that's actually really, really good. So whoever's watching, it's about an hour. We'll go a few more minutes. If you have any questions, then let me know. I'll try to peruse the comments here, see if we missed anything. Now, one thing I want to get into with libertarian free will, it seems to me a lot of Christians who espouse the libertarian free will, when you start peeling the onion back, a lot of times it comes to, okay, God can't truly love us unless he gives us this libertarian free will because he wants to have a relationship, and it gets all to this stuff here. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's assume that they're right for a moment. Well, and let's just assume people die and they're in heaven, right? Do they have libertarian free will in heaven? And if they say yes, then they have to admit that they could sin in heaven, right? Because there has to be the ability to choose otherwise. And if they say no, then all of a sudden they turn into a compatibilist because they won't want to sin in heaven. So it's kind of it's more like a mind experiment, just carrying out the thought process. Have you ever thought of it that way, or have you run into this?
Yeah, actually, I've developed an argument. It's I don't have it with me right now, but I think I shared it with your group. I think Irresistible Truth. I think way back, like months ago, but just to kind of see how it would go, and I think I could defend it pretty well. But basically, it's that idea. It poses a dilemma. You can't categorically sin in heaven, yet you're morally responsible. So why is it the fact that we need the category on earth to be morally responsible? That makes no sense. And if they say, oh, well, it's just the case you can sin, but you just wouldn't want to sin in heaven. Great. That's not the category anymore. That's the conditional. And we've been affirming that all along.
Right.
So it's kind of bonkers here. It's just it's a nice dilemma to posit. And in fact, I believe open theist Gregory Boyd, in one of his articles in one of the co-authored books he writes, I think he actually completely concedes that in heaven, it should be compatibilist freedom. Like we should have compatibilist freedom. As an open theist, he says that.
He comes out and says it. Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, he's like, oh, we don't have it right here, but in like God is making us so that in heaven we would have the compatibilist freedom. Like that's the crowning achievement. If that's the crowning achievement, then why don't we have it here? If we can be morally responsible in heaven, yet not sin like God, okay, then why do we need the category necessary down here for responsibility as well?
That's good. Yeah, that's real good, actually. So I made a quick comment in the beginning how sometimes, you run into an atheist who's a compatibilist or whatever. They believe in libertarian free will, or maybe a lot of atheists are compatibilists.
Yeah.
What would you say are the differences between, obviously, salvation and all that, but is it because, and I know there's been even scientific studies and all this stuff, and it points to more of a compatibilistic, deterministic frame, but since you're more in that world, what have you seen? How would you differentiate? And if someone's like, well, you're a compatibilist, that's what atheists believe, and all that stuff, it's like, what would be your discussion on that?
Well, first, even if atheists believe in compatibilism and we're compatibilists, doesn't mean that we're getting our philosophy from atheists.
Right.
If anything, it just means that compatibilism is true because more people agree with us. That's pretty much what it is. Now, obviously, that's not to appeal to a majority fallacy, but it definitely lends itself sort of to that idea. And secondly, I think we, as just human beings in general, because we're all created in the image of God, regardless of whether or not you're atheist, we can think and we can devise good theories on moral responsibility, regardless of your metaphysical religious background. And so, for instance, Frankfurt style examples and Fisher and Raviza's work from Responsibility and Control that use Frankfurt style examples that try to give us sufficiency for moral responsibility, though determinism obtains, all of that, that is made by atheists. Those are concocted by atheists, except I think Mark Raviza, I think, is a I think he's a theist, but John Martin Fisher, he's openly atheist, even though he's technically by heritage a Jew, a secular Jew. But their philosophy works perfect underneath the compatibilist Calvinist construct. In fact, that book, Preciado, Michael Patrick Preciado, he just came out with his dissertation about 2 years ago, and it's called A Reformed View of Freedom, the Compatibility of Guidance Control, Fisher's Theory from an Atheist, okay, Fisher's Compatibilist Theory, the Compatibility of Guidance Control and Reformed Theology. So so what Michael Preciado does there is try to show that even though that this is an atheistic philosophy, we as Christians actually have resources to answer some of their flaws. So like one of their flaws in their theory was what they call mechanism ownership. As an atheistic worldview, you don't really have any mechanism ownership. It's kind of hard to say whether or not you have mechanism ownership. How can you own your own reasons? But as a theist, we can just posit the Imago Dei or the sensus divinitatis, and we have those kinds of resources there that they don't have. So we kind of congeal with each other. We kind of go with each other, and it's good. That's what truth is, and that's we can use it against them. It's like, hey, you should become a Christian because now you can actually have a good theory. Now we can actually use it as an evangelistic technique.
So do a 20-second on sensus divinitatis from Calvin.
Yeah,
just do a quick thing on that.
Sensus divinitatis came from John Calvin, and there's controversy on how you interpret it, and it was popularized by Alvin Plantinga in his epistemology books. But sensus divinitatis is Latin for the sense of the divine. Because we're made in the image of God, we all have a sense of the divine. So you can call that conscience, consciousness, or whatever. From Romans 2, we all have a God-shaped hole in our heart, as what like Jean-Paul Sartre said. Those kinds of things, that kind of general idea, we call the sensus divinitatis. We all have a sense of the divine, and that sense is what keeps us grounded and morally responsible to God.
Very good, very good. So I was going to ask you this, but we had someone ask in the chat here. So any book? So you obviously just mentioned the Reformed View of Freedom, and then there's a whole subtitle thing. Just say that one more time in the author, just so people can jot it down, and then give us. I know we mentioned Freedom of the Will, but give us 2 or 3 books that you kind of recommend for people to check out.
So, A Reformed View of Freedom, the Compatibility of Guidance Control and Reformed Theology from Michael Patrick Preciado. It's blue and has a nice little cute feather on it. You can buy it on Amazon. And then obviously Guillaume Bignon, his book is called Excusing Sinners and Blaming God. I think it's probably, I'm totally biased because I'm a Calvinist, but that's okay. I think it's the best thing since sliced bread, personally, only because I think it's a well overdue, fantastic exposition, Calvinist assessment on the 2 greatest rebuttals given to the Calvinists. And that is, if God determines all things, you're excused. You don't have any freedom. And if God determines all things, it's not you that does it, but God himself that does it. So he's to be blamed. So rightly, the book is called Excusing Sinners, Blaming God, kind of cheekily, and trying to defend against this idea. And he gives some arguments for compatibilist freedom and why it ought to obtain. And it's just extremely well written. And so those 2 books I would recommend. Providence of God by Paul Helm, made in 93. So that's a classic Calvinist work. And then a Calvinist work that is not really, that's kind of expensive, and it's really hard to find, but it's actually from a guy named Thaddeus Williams, and it's called Love, Freedom, and Evil. And it tries to show that free will, libertarian free will, is not compatible, or is not necessary, rather, for genuine love. So you don't need libertarian free will to have genuine love. So that book is called Love, Freedom, and Evil, and it's by Thaddeus Williams.
Is he one of the guys from like the 1800s or something? He sounds like an older guy. But...
No, actually, he works at Biola University. He's alive.
So he's still...
Yeah. So it was published in 2011. And it's a nice little excursus on analytical theology. It's not necessarily philosophical like like Preciado and Helms and Bignon's book, but it is kind of analytically theological, and it's fantastic. And if you read those side by side, you get a really nice, good framework for Calvinist compatibilism. I think that,
and it's huge because oftentimes they can put words to the stuff you're thinking about and you can't describe it, and they're like, boom, this is what it's called. And I mean, it's really a cool thing. So so we have a question here. What is the strongest argument against libertarian free will? Now, besides the Bible, right? So
that's a great question. I'm kind of torn between a couple. So I do like the Pelagian argument personally. That's my favorite. Basically, if the categorical ability is true, you could categorically choose righteousness your whole life. In and of yourself, that's what the categorical ability entails, that you could choose righteousness always, which means that entails that it is possible for you to live a sinless life. And I think that's ridiculous. So basically, it's an reductio ad absurdum argument. And Bignon, from Excusing Sinners, Blaming God, he's kind of brought that to light. It's not original to him. It was actually, I think, formulated more specifically from Luther's Bondage of the Will in response to Erasmus. And so Luther kind of plays on that, and then Bignon tries to prove it using what he calls recurrence theory, which is really interesting. But that's probably, I would say, the strongest argument. The second strongest argument, I think, would probably be the moral agency argument in heaven, that we don't have compatibilists, or we don't have libertarian freedom in heaven. And if we don't need it in heaven, then why do we need it here? Like, what's the difference between now and heaven, especially when heaven is supposed to be this best thing? If libertarian freedom is so great, then why don't we have it in heaven? And we need that category there, but we don't. We can't sin. We can't do the liberty of contradiction in heaven. So if we don't have it in heaven, then why do we need it here? I think it's a good argument by analogy.
Now, would you say libertarian free will, as we know it today, doing research myself, I mean, it seems like the terminology and what we look at it as today is just a pagan concept anyway. I mean, I've traced it back to, say, the Epicureans a few hundred years before Christ. I mean, have you ever done that side of the study and try to back it? And
it goes way back. Even Sorsa goes back to Aristotle. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, he was one of the first to actually, publish or at least lecture about someone being the determiner other than yourself, then you're not free. So those, I've kind of dabbled with the history behind it, but I think arguments from history are kind of personally overrated. I don't think they kind of get anywhere because they're just so far back, and it gives more room for eisegesis rather than historical exegesis. Yeah. So I would rather stick with the philosophical arguments rather than the historical arguments there.
Okay. And then last couple questions, unless someone else pops in here, but tell me, did Adam and Eve have free will? Does God have free will? Those type of questions. Give us your take on that.
Yeah. Great question. This is actually a question that's fascinated me so forever. I talk about it all the time. Essentially, I would say no, they did not have libertarian freedom. And that's kind of difficult because as a Calvinist, especially when the Westminster says they had this natural liberty given to them, we have to kind of exegete what that natural liberty means. And I think Preciado in that book, A Reformed View of Freedom, does a really good job on it, where he still shows that determinism was still obtaining by the decree of God, yet they were, free in the compatibilistic sense. So no, I would say they do not have libertarian freedom. That doesn't mean that they don't have a choice. It just means that they didn't have libertarian freedom.
So there wasn't when the fall happened, the curse, there wasn't this change where, I think, was it Augustine? He talks about the ability to sin, ability to not sin. And so Preciado would say it was just it's been the same. It's just God's decrees were different. And
yes. And that's kind of, it's a secondary issue, I think, in the Reformed circles. It's
Sure.
not like a big issue because obviously they did sin. So we're here. Like, we're mainly concerned about whether or not we have that kind of freedom given original sin. But I would say, and I would slightly agree with Preciado, even though not all Reformed Calvinists do agree, that they did not have libertarian freedom. I think some reformers like Oliver Crisp try to argue that libertarian freedom is compatible with Adam and Eve and Reformed theology. I don't think that he does a good job at it, nor do I think he actually affirms it. I just think he's trying to show that it could be compatible. But yeah, I agree that determinism still obtained even in the garden. If determinism is true, then that means it is exhaustive, contrary to what some of the flaming libertarians today say.
And then how about God, right? So there's issues sometimes where people talk about God choosing, and then he's choosing in our timetable, so to speak, versus he's not chosen because he decreed it all. Like, do you even think this equates to anything with God, or what's your take on that? I know the question comes up, and
it does, and it's kind of hard. It's just hard to figure out whether or not God has some sort of freedom. I personally say that yes, he could have chosen between one world and not another world. But let's just say determinism obtains, like, this is the best possible world. So if determinism is true, I think this must be the best possible world for God to achieve the maximum glory. So if that's true, then does God have the real libertarian choice is whether or not he could have created, or whether or not he chose to create, right? So could he create and not create? In that sense, I'm inclined and I'm sympathetic to saying that God has libertarian freedom in that one choice. But once the decree is rolled, the decree is rolled out. Like, he's made promises, he's sticking with his decree, he finishes what he started. So I don't think God could do other than what he has decreed. And he willingly put that constraint upon himself. Let's just say libertarianly. So to say that does God have libertarian freedom right now, I think is erroneous. I think at one time, perhaps he had libertarian freedom, but I do not think he has libertarian freedom right now. I would rather say that he has something maybe akin to source incompatibilism. Nothing outside of him is determining him besides himself, and he is the efficient causal source of his own actions. We can't say that, but he can, because he's God, right? So I think at best, we can say that God currently has what we call source incompatibilist freedom. And that's not libertarianism. So that, like, God has libertarianism, or one comment said that Romans 1 doesn't make sense unless God has libertarianism is there. I think that's bogus. It's not been shown. I think from what we know of God, I think that's the best we can do. Source incompatibilism.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me ask you, we're going to shut this thing down here in a second, but was there anything else we might have not said or talked about that you wanted to get in here, or anything for the audience, motivating them to get into some of this stuff?
I would just like to say that I think when most incompatibilists, most libertarian, and we kind of stressed it already, but when they go into the discussion forums, when you debate with the Calvinists, you have to be very, very for libertarians and incompatibilists and non-Calvinists here, they have to be very, very cautious on their definitions, like you said, it alluded to, on what determinism means, because it's not the case that God just makes them do stuff like that. He doesn't just make them do things. That's not what determinism means. So they just need to brush up on the philosophy. They need to get down, do the dirty work, do the homework, and do it. But I also like to say that as a Calvinist, for a long time, I was a proof texter for a long time and didn't want to think, and I had my head in the sand, and I just wanted to do that until a lot of non-Calvinists started pushing me. A lot of Arminians started pushing me. So I would also like to encourage Calvinists, like, there are answers. You need to find them. You need to search them. I've given you good books to go there, and I think there are good answers within those books to start thinking and developing good defenses against our non-Calvinist friends here. So that's
Wow.
my encouragement.
I think it's great, man. I learned a lot. It was awesome to talk. I love talking to, you're very technical with some of this stuff, and it's great to hear. I'm going to have to watch this again and see some of the cool stuff you said. So with that said, to all of our audience, thanks so much for the questions. Thanks for watching us. For those that watch later, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe if you don't mind. And until next time, have a great night.